everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today I'd like to present to you guys with another What If video on Wings of Fire. What if Morrowseer found out about Moonwatcher? This one is mentioned by a lot of you guys, and it honestly stuck with me ever since I heard it originally, because this would make for a great What If. Thank you so much to all the people on screen for suggesting this idea. The video does contain spoilers for Moon Rising, so if you haven't read that book, then please click off. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the video. Secret Keeper knew the dangers of Morrowseer finding out about their egg. He was truthfully a good dragon if you looked really deep inside of him. And apparently a lot of other Nightwings found it really hard to. There was a part of Morrowseer that was loving. It was just very, very deep. Despite this, she knew that he would insist their dragonet would be raised in the island if he found out. So, to prevent their previous dragonet from having to live in an ashy and possibly explosive volcano, Secret Keeper had to have their egg hatch in the rainforest. Maybe she could even sneak out and watch them hatch. After all, keeping a secret shouldn't be that hard, right? It was in her name. With that thought in mind, Secret Keeper anxiously glanced at the two moons in the sky. She's going to hatch now, Secret Keeper! Get over there before she does, because who knows what could happen to a newborn dragonet in the middle of the rainforest if no one is there to protect her. Finally stopping pacing back and forth across the smoothened rock, Secret Keeper finally took a deep breath and quietly began walking down the hallway. Some of the Nightwings were giving her curious and strange looks, but she kept her head down and kept walking. Get to the tunnel! Get to the tunnel! After what seemed like an eternity of rapid breathing and subtle steps, she finally managed to reach the tunnel that led to the rainforest. Secret Keeper's heart was fluttering with excitement, her face now in a ridiculous grin of excitement to see her dragonet. What she didn't notice when she stepped into the tunnel, however, was the shadow of Morrowseer behind her. Morrowseer flicked his tail angrily. Secret Keeper wasn't due to go hunting until next week. What could she possibly be doing in the rainforest at such an hour? It had been lucky he managed to spot her slinking out of her cave, otherwise she surely would have gotten herself into trouble. Morrowseer growled under his breath, waiting momentarily outside the tunnel's entrance. Secret Keeper's not the kind of dragon to purposely hide something from me. She does as she's told. So what's she gotten herself into now? Carefully and quietly, Morrowseer followed Secret Keeper into the tunnel, being sure to keep his distance. What he did not expect, however, was to see her crouched on the rainforest floor, holding a delicate egg in her talons. Morrowseer was seething in rage at the thought of Secret Keeper hiding a dragonet from him. She was never a rebellious or secretive dragon, despite her name. She followed the rules, listened to him and the Queen, but why did she decide to lie to him? Did she really think she could raise this dragonet in the rainforest without the other Nightwings? She knows the plan. She did this on purpose, Morrowseer told himself. He watched the hatching unfold, concealing himself in the shadows of the tunnel. Rage filled every fiber of his being. He would have never gotten a Secret Keeper if he would have known that she was going to betray the tribe. Where had her loyalties even lied in the first place? The Morrowseer was nearly twitching with disgust and hatred. Secret Keeper felt tears dripping down her snout, the beautiful dragonet in her claws. She was so tiny, so delicate. She smiled down at her daughter, holding her close to her chest as she began talking to her. "It's your mother, little one. I'm here." Morrowseer had seen enough. She was coddling the dragonet instead of taking her back to the island where she belonged. No Nightwing had been hatched anywhere else besides their kingdom since the ages of Darkstalker, and he refused to let such treason be allowed. Stepping out of the shadows, Morrowseer glared down at Secret Keeper. She jumped back in surprise, holding Moonwatcher even closer than she had been before. Moon squeaked loudly, tears brimming in her eyes as she dug herself in the crook of her mother's arms. The giant form of Morrowseer loomed over them, blocking out the moonlight and leaving only darkness. "You've broken Nightwing law, Secret Keeper. All dragonets are supposed to be born in the hatchery where they can be watched over," Morrowseer grumbled. She sat there on the grass, mouth agape. Things had been perfect. Nobody was following her. She checked. "Morrowseer, you know how awful the island is. I don't want our dragonet having to live on a stuffy volcano where she wouldn't be guaranteed a meal each week. And yet you hid her from me." The two of them stood there in silence, Moonwatcher just trying to make herself as small as possible while her father angrily glared at her. Even just being born, Moonwatcher could tell that he was judging her in every way. Too round, too shiny, too clean, too healthy to be a Nightwing. Or maybe those were the first things she heard in her father's mind. Either way, his expression said it all. She was doomed to be an outcast from the beginning. Moonwatcher always felt the eyes of the other Nightwings on her. Morrowseer thought that it would be an excellent idea to tell Queen Battlewinter and the entire NightWing Council about her powers the moment he figured out she was a mind reader. And of course, word spread quickly, making Moon the most gossiped about dragon in the entire NightWing Kingdom. Because of her father's undivided attention and obsession with her once he figured out that Moonwatcher was the first NightWing mind reader in over 1,000 years, he never let her get out of his sights. All that attention from their second-in-command made other dragons jealous, and no matter how many times Moon tried to tell them she didn't want his attention, she still got dirty looks. Just to rile her up even further, the other dragonets cast ugly thoughts in their heads just so she could hear them. "Look at Daddy's little favorite," or "You're so entitled," were the ones she heard most often. Basically, every dragon in the Night Kingdom hated her due to their jealousy. Some were even creeped out by her powers, rushing into every nook and cranny when they saw her coming. Their frantic thoughts about her reading their mind were the last thing she could hear before they dashed out of the room. Whenever she stayed in her classroom to work on her homework scroll, she was either sitting there with nobody or a lot of disgusted-looking Nightwings glaring back at her. Dirty looks and rude comments whenever Morrowseer wasn't there was all she could get sometimes, but the moments she spent with her father were even worse. Morrowseer was obsessed with how she could fit into the war, and constantly told her that she could even take the place of the Nightwing Dragonet in the prophecy if they were able to make the switch. Morrowseer's outward appearance was just as bad as his inward appearance, because his thoughts were just as manipulative. She heard him scheming all night about how he could use her to win the war, and frankly, it disgusted her. Moonwatcher wanted to cover her ears and scream for the noise to go away, but other dragons' thoughts were all she heard day after day. She was forbidden to see her mother due to her treason, but Morrowseer kept her alive, convinced he could have uses for her later. Though his thoughts indicated that he quite liked her presence before their arguments, but the birth of her changed all that. "Way to go, Moon! You just ruined more lives by existing." According to old Nightwing law, she apparently had foresight, but she hadn't even had her first vision yet, and she was already a few years old. Morrowseer kept telling her it was that because she wasn't trying hard enough, even Moon had begun to believe that. But for now, she laid curled up in a tightly wound ball, while she heard the thoughts of the dragonets trying to go to sleep next to her. Most were grumbling good nights to their friends, getting ready to finally sleep for the night. She could hear the whispers in their heads, most grateful that they thought she was asleep. But she was used to it. Moonwatcher's used to the treatment she got for powers she couldn't even control. But Moon knew she would always be a monster in their eyes, shunned off from everyone except for her manipulative and controlling father, who only thought of her as a tool to be used during the war. One sentence, started off with a sigh of relief, interrupted Moon's thoughts. "I'm pretty sure she can't read our minds while she's asleep." Other Nightwings hummed in agreement, finally settling down in their beds. "She's really creepy. Like, really creepy. She just stares at me sometimes. It's really weird." "Exactly! And Morrowseer thinks she's some kind of miracle dragon just because she has some stupid powers. If I were born under one of the moons, I would totally be using my powers instead of moping around." Moonwatcher, still being sure her eyes were closed, tried to wipe off any fury or anxiety that could be shown in her face. She could easily just get up and shout at them for talking about her behind her back, but wouldn't she do the same if she were them? "I really am weird. Morrowseer knows it too. He would have abandoned me in the rainforest with Mother if I wouldn't have had these powers. Although, maybe that life would have been better. I would be guaranteed a meal every single day, and the air wouldn't choke me every time I inhaled. Secret Keeper would have been a great parent, if she hadn't been caught by Morrowseer on my hatching day." Without warning, the awake dragons suddenly ran into their beds, trying to fake as though they had been asleep for hours. Moon barely had time to think about why, when suddenly she heard the same dark thoughts that were unmistakable. The ones of her father. Morrowseer stomped in the dragonet's room, scoffing when he saw the others fake snoring in order to evade trouble. But he wasn't here for them. Moonwatcher knew it. The flicking in and out of his tongue, a repetitive action he subconsciously did while angry, seemed to be louder than usual. "You," were the only words he spoke, pointing a talon in Moonwatcher's direction. "I know you're awake. Let's go." Moonwatcher slowly raised her head, clumsily collecting herself and trying to follow in Morrowseer's direction. He didn't even glance back at the other dragonets, who were blinking in confusion and anxiety, knowing that she had heard them the entire time. Their thoughts were only a dull hum in the back of her mind, because Moon could only focus on one thing. Something big was happening tonight. She followed her father, head down, as they approached the entrance to Queen Battlewinter's council room. The chambers were empty when Morrowseer knocked on the door, with only Battlewinter and Greatness inside. Moon never saw Princess Greatness that often, except when she was talking for her mother, but she seemed more tired than usual. The bags under her eyes, though she tried to rub them away at their entrance, were still prominent on her face. Without a word, Morrowseer motioned for Moonwatcher to follow him into the chambers. Things were eerily silent, more than they had been in a while. Moon swallowed, her throat dry. The thoughts she was hearing in her father's head seemed rash and unnecessary. If he was going to propose what she was hearing him think about... "It is a pleasure for you to come here, Moonwatcher," Greatness said. "You can just call me Moon, Princess." The comment got a snarl and a scoff from Morrowseer, but Greatness ignored it and nodded in response. "Morrowseer and the Queen have been proposing a plan, one quite different from the original prophecy, because of your special case." "Yeah, my powers," Moon thought. "You still haven't received any visions?" "No, but She's not trying hard enough, Your Majesties. I've tried training her, but she hasn't seen anything. It seems like she may only be a mind reader after all," Morrowseer barked out, much to Moon's embarrassment. "Why do you still feel the need to impress him?" she thought, clawing at her head with irritation. Queen Battlewinter whispered something to her daughter, with the two of them standing in silence. "Mother says that you'll still be useful, even without your prophecy powers. The scrolls could have been inaccurate, since Mastermind said they weren't really from the age of Darkstalker, but rather a little while after. Your mind reading will still help us take over the rainforest. Blister will probably like another powerful asset." Moonwatcher shifted uncomfortably. "Of course you're just someone friendly to use. Why did you ever think you were more than that?" The times Moon spent with her mother, though there were very few of them, were the best times of her life. Secret Keeper made Moonwatcher feel less like an asset and more like an actual dragon. She didn't care that her daughter was different, and loved her regardless. Morrowseer claimed that her time with her mother made her soft, and Secret Keeper was sent back to the dungeons as punishment. He used the lie of her treason as a way to get Queen Battlewinter to allow him to do whatever he wanted with Secret Keeper. Sighing momentarily, Moon nodded. "I'll do what it takes for my tribe to live a good life." Morrowseer smiled with pride, as though she were his creation and that had turned out perfectly moldable and easy to use whenever the right situation arose. It wasn't a smile she enjoyed seeing, to say the least. "Good. Queen Battlewinter says that you'll be ready to go to the continent soon, and you can join Morrowseer in a meeting with Blister next week. After that, we'll discuss our future plans with you. Your future's already looking bright as a NightWing hero, Moonwatcher. Alongside your father, you two will go down in history as being the savior of the NightWings." "Yeah, and the slayer of innocent dragons if she uses my powers. Dragons won't be able to think for themselves if they live in fear of Blister's mind-reading ally watching them at all times. Even though I can't use my foresight, mind reading is dangerous enough. Who knows what Morrowseer will do with me once I'm done serving my purpose, or decide to make my own choices." But despite her inner thoughts, Moonwatcher nodded. After all, she had no choice. But she hated the smug look on her father's face, and never before in her life had she ever wanted to scratch off his snout like that. "Breathe in and out, Moonwatcher. Just roll with it for now. Maybe later you'll have more freedom, after the war." Moon tossed and turned that night, filled with awful nightmares about her own claws covered in Morrowseer's blood. Except it didn't feel like a normal dream. It felt unnaturally real, like she was seeing the actual horror in his eyes and hearing the screams of surrounding dragons. Moon shot up out of bed, panting as she wiped the sweat that lined her brow. That dream felt too real. Way too real. But it can't be a vision. I would never lash out at Morrowseer like that, even though I dislike his treatment of me. Right? The memories of the hatred she felt towards him during the small council assembly flashed in her mind. With no other option she could have thought of, Moonwatcher tried going to the NightWing library to research anything she could on NightWing visions. She flipped through scrolls as the librarian snored on the desk, trying to make as little noise as possible. Morrowseer would be furious and confused as to why she was scouring through the library at such an hour. Finally, after it seemed like an eternity, Moon found a chapter on NightWing gifts. She related to all the mind-reading information, like constant migraines and feeling overwhelmed at the never-ending thoughts of other dragons. The chapter on visions seemed scarily familiar to her. A NightWing dragon experiencing a prophetic vision usually experienced them during dreams, or even sometimes during the day. They often described it as a splitting pain that caused them to collapse when awake, or a horribly accurate nightmare. "That's what happened to me," Moon whispered to herself, quietly closing the book and taking deep breaths. "You can change your fate, Moon. It's just a stupid vision. Morrowseer doesn't even need to know you had it, because you know it'll happen if he finds out. Just Calm down. Think about the vision later when you have more time to figure out how to stop that from happening. But deep down, Moonwatcher knew that there was nothing she could do. Somehow, the death of all those dragons would be her fault. She refused to admit it, but visions had never been recorded as being avoided. Yet she kept telling herself she could change her fate. No reassurances were enough to convince herself. Moonwatcher had become accustomed to pacing back and forth around her cave. She grew used to the empty feeling in her stomach when the smallest things reminded her of the vision, and how fate almost seemed inescapable. Morrowseer hardly noticed how she seemed more reserved than usual, but rather continued his boasting about how him and his daughter were going to save the NightWings from extinction. So much for thinking there was a part of him that cared about me. I'm still just an asset, just like Blister will think of me as. Moon found herself snapping at dragons more than usual whenever she was interrupted from her thoughts. However, she barely noticed that she didn't seem to care as much when she heard their worried thoughts as they ran away from her. Her emotions seemed dulled and nullified, almost as if they weren't there at those times she was so lost in thought. Fate can be altered. I don't like Morrowseer, but I don't have it in me to hurt him. Secret Keeper wouldn't want it. Oh, I wish I could see her right now. Big fat tears rolled down Moonwatcher's cheeks as she looked at herself in the water bowl. Her stupid teardrop scales had to just be there whenever she looked at herself, a constant reminder of all the pressure she couldn't escape, the destiny she couldn't run from. It's like her whole life was already written out by Queen Battlewinter and Morrowseer, but she hated it. But the vision is the only time where they're the ones not in control of me. No! You told yourself you would never do it, Moon. She was in a constant mental battle of hating being controlled, but also worried about making her own choices and fear that her father would be the one killed for it. And in that moment, the moment where Moon was at her weakest mental stage, with unstable thoughts flowing through her brain, Morrowseer stepped in her living quarters. Moon is hiccuping and continually sobbing. The plan's changed, Moonwatcher, he grumbled, standing over her and tipping over the water bowl with one claw. Blister is coming here. She wanted to see our fortress and the tunnel of the rainforest herself. We couldn't convince her otherwise, and she's flying over here right now to meet with you, me, and the Queen. Moonwatcher couldn't believe what she was hearing. But not only that, he ignored how upset she was feeling. He didn't care! Did he ever? Moon had finally hit her breaking point. Morrowseer didn't stop to ask if she was okay. He never did. He didn't stop to ask if she even wanted to meet Blister, or if she even wanted to help take over the rainforest, use her powers like that. He never asked what she wanted! She looked up at him, angrily wiping the tears from her eyes. Morrowseer had the most blank and bored expression on his face, his thoughts mostly of that she looked weak in that moment. I'll show him weak. After all the manipulative mental torture she had to go through those 4 years of her life, Moonwatcher snapped. She finally gave in to the temptation of making her own choices, even if it ended with her father paying for it. Because he deserved it. It was going to be so rewarding to never have to see his smug face again, or the terrified look on other dragons' faces when he ordered their executions. Moonwatcher, without hesitation, jumped up at her father's snout. She thrashed at it wildly, brandishing her claws and slicing every part of him that she could reach. Moon had the advantage of his shock in order to get the upper talon, and she jumped back to see what she had done. Morrowseer stood there, blood dripping from his snout and gushing from his nostrils. His breath came out in heaves and heavy pants, and he looked up at her in shock. His neck wounds were the most dangerous, and he swayed over to the side, falling to the floor with a massive thud. Moon thought she would feel satisfied, but the moment she looked at her bloody and bruised claws, she felt a wave of regret and guilt. The vision seemed to flash right before her eyes again, and she was in the exact same position it had ended in. Moonwatcher's breath came out rugged and wet. She looked horrified by what she had done. For the first time ever, no thoughts went through Morrowseer's mind. It was silent. Moonwatcher, feeling the weight of what she had done, collapsed on the floor next to him. Dragons were running in and screaming at the sight of Morrowseer's corpse. Their voices were just ringing in her ears, and she ignored them. Moon ignored everything but the sound of her own breathing and sobs as she curled herself up next to him. She tried making herself as small as possible, putting her head in the crook of his arm as she sobbed. In that moment, Moon only thought one thing. What if Morrowseer had never found out that I existed? Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. I honestly had a lot more fun writing this one than I originally thought I was going to have, and it was quite enjoyable. Feel free to complete the story in the comments with how Blister would react when she would see the whole NightWing kingdom in ruins with their Lord and Savior dead, and what would become of Moonwatcher. Once again, huge shout out to all the people who suggested this. You guys just have the greatest ideas for what ifs. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.